shall turn to dawning, and the dawning to noonday bright. And Christ's great kingdom shall come on earth, the kingdom of love and light. We've a song to be sung to the nations, thou shalt lift their hearts to the Lord, a song that shall conquer evil and shatter the spear and sword, and shatter the spear and sword. For the darkness shall turn to dawning, and the dawning to noonday bright. And Christ's great kingdom shall come on earth, the kingdom of love and light. We've a message to give to the nations, that the Lord who reigneth above hath sent us his Son to save us and show us that God is love, and show us that God is love. For the darkness shall turn to dawning, and the dawning to noonday bright. And Christ's great kingdom shall come on earth, the kingdom of love and light. We've a Savior to show to the nations, who the path of sorrow hath trod, that all of the world's great peoples might come to the truth of God, might come to the truth of God. For the darkness shall turn to dawning, and the dawning to noonday bright. And Christ's great kingdom shall come on earth, the kingdom of love and light. And Christ's great kingdom shall come on earth, the kingdom of love and light, the kingdom of love and light. Okay, y'all can be seated. I love to tell the story of unseen things above, of Jesus and his glory, of Jesus and his love. I love to tell the story because I know 'tis true. It satisfies my longing as nothing else can do. I love to tell the story, will be my theme in glory, to tell the old story of Jesus and his love. I love to tell the story, 'tis pleasant to repeat. What seems each time I tell it more wonderfully sweet. I love to tell the story, for some have never heard the message of salvation from God's own holy word. I love to tell the story, will be my theme in glory, to tell the old story of Jesus and his love. I love to tell the story for those who know it best. Seems hungering and thirsting to hear it like the rest. And when in scenes of glory I sing the new song, will be the old story that I have loved so long. I love to tell the story, Jesus and his love. Open my eyes that I may see glimpses of truth thou hast for me. Placed on my hands the wonderful key that shall unclasp and set me free. Silently now I wait for thee, ready, my God, thy will to see. Open my eyes, illumine me, Spirit divine. Open my ears that I may hear voices of truth thou sendest clear. And while the wave notes fall on my ear, everything false will disappear. Open my mouth and let me bear gladly the warm truth everywhere. Open my heart and let me prepare love with thy children to share. We got messed up on the. That's it.
Oh, thank you, Weldon. Good to get off with a couple of songs, isn't it? Sure good to see y'all here. Like I told everybody else, 31 of them are over at Lake Murray right now. So they'll be back later tonight, but I'm glad you're here. We're going to be looking tonight at the first chapter of the book of Galatians. We're going to start in verse 11. Now, last week we started this up, and I mentioned then to you that in the book of Galatians, we have Paul revealing himself, telling more about himself personally, about anywhere else in the Bible. And in fact, the first two chapters are really Paul getting personal, talking about the things that have happened to him in his ministry and about some of the experiences that he has. Chapters 3 and 4 are more doctrinal. He's going to really get into some doctrine with the people, with the churches here in Galatia. And notice I said churches. This is the only letter that Paul wrote that was written to a multiplicity of churches. The others were just written to a single church, but these churches in Galatia were among the first churches that Paul established on his first missionary journey. And so he gets into some doctrine about that, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. But then in the end, he gives a personal application as to how they should take this doctrine that he's given them and apply it to their daily lives, because really that's one of the important things that we as Christians must do, isn't it? We must take what we know and translate it into action. And so that's what Paul is going to be doing in this chapter. Now, as I said, the churches in Galatia were special to him because they were the first ones that he had established. Now, I also told you that these folks who inhabited the area of Galatia. Now, Galatia was a province of Asia Minor, or today, modern-day Turkey, and it encompassed a large area from down to the Mediterranean Sea up north almost to the Black Sea. Not quite, but almost. And the inhabitants that Paul is writing to here they're people who had migrated there some centuries ago from Gaul or France, which is unusual because most of the time we see expansions, pilgrimages, pioneers going from east to west, but this time they came from west to east. And they had this peculiar trait nationally where they were known as mercenary soldiers. And they would hire themselves out to people, and sometimes they'd switch sides even in the midst of the battle, just depending on who got to them last. And that kind of explains what is happening here theologically, because what Paul is really getting into right here is he is telling them that that these false teachers, they were called Judaizers, they were coming along and they were going to these churches that Paul had established and put so much sweat equity into. And they were telling these people in Galatia that first of all, before you can become a Christian, you have to become a Jew. Now, Paul's whole ministry was directed towards telling these people that it is grace, as he would say to the church at Ephesus, chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, he would say, by grace you're saved, through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God and not of works, in case anybody should boast. And so these Judaizers were coming along and saying, yeah, Jesus saves, but you got to do this before you can be a Christian. And there's still some that are saying that today. And whenever we do our denominational study on Sunday night, we'll see some of that. So, anyway, Paul is writing to these churches in Galatia. And here in this first chapter, and in the second as well, he's going to get very personal, and he's going to fill in some blanks that we don't have anywhere else about his ministry. And so what he's doing is going back and recounting some of these things. You know, a reputation can be good or it can be bad. And it kind of depends on the morality and the standards of those who are judging you by whatever reputation you have. Let me explain that. Paul, when we first see him in the 8th chapter of the book of Acts, we see him with a good reputation as far as the Jewish religious leaders were depending. Because you see, their opinion of his reputation was based on the fact that he violently opposed the Christians there, and in fact was arresting, throwing in jail as many as he could get his hands on. And so he had a good reputation for the Jewish people. But then he had a very bad reputation for the Christians, because you see, they're the ones he was arresting. But then, as we see in chapter 9 of the book, we see this remarkable turnaround that Paul had. And 180 degrees almost instantaneously, because we see how he saw the resurrected Christ appeared to him in a flash, and he only saw it, and only he heard it. It was intended only for him. Those who were traveling with him saw a flash of light, and they heard a noise, but it was like a bolt of lightning and thunder following it. But Paul saw Christ and heard Christ. And so whenever that happened, his life was turned around instantly. You see, Jesus Christ can change a person instantly. And so what happened was that his reputation then became bad according to the Jewish religious leaders, because now he was doing the work of Christianity. But it didn't become good to the Christians for a while. Because you see, a bad reputation is very difficult to turn around, isn't it? Once you get this reputation for being a certain way, people are going to look upon you suspiciously. And it would take Paul a long time before he would finally get the trust of many Christians. You see, what we're talking about here on this Damascus Road incident was about 6 years after the resurrection of Christ. So some time had passed during that period. And during that period, they had wreaked havoc upon the Christian community, to the extent that you'll remember in the 7th chapter of Acts that there was a deacon by the name of Stephen who was stoned to death by these people. And it says, as chapter 8 of the book of Acts begins, it says that Saul, and that was his name before his conversion, Saul was consenting towards the death. Now, how'd they get away with that? Because don't you remember that when they brought Jesus Christ to trial, they weren't allowed to put anybody to death. That was the privilege of the Roman authority. And so how is it that they got away with stoning this man, Stephen, to death, And how did they get away with arresting all of these Christians? To understand that, you have to go to the history books. Because we see that Pontius Pilate was the procurator or the governor of Judea from the year 26 to the year 36. Now that would be the time, of course, whenever Jesus was crucified. But in 36, because of some of the excesses of Pontius Pilate, Tiberius Caesar had him recalled to Rome. And so for a few years there was a void where there wasn't any really Roman authority there. Oh, they had a governor, but he didn't get out of Caesarea Philippi, or not Caesarea Philippi, Caesarea, there on the Mediterranean shore. He stayed put in the palace and just kind of let them do whatever they wanted to with their vigilante violence. And so they got away with it for quite a while. And this would continue until several years later. And as for Paul, like I say, it took a while to turn his reputation around. And it would be 9 years before he would even start out on his first missionary journey. And as we're going to see, he would return to his hometown in Tarsus and teach and preach there for a while until finally people realized this guy's for real. And he has really changed. It takes a longer time to turn a bad reputation around than it does to have a good reputation to start with. We need to remember that. So anyway, we start off here and we see Paul, and he's starting to confess some of the things that he had done previously. And so if you'll look in chapter 1, verse 11, and by the way, this study is probably going to take about 3 months. I mean, we'll probably finish sometime in September. So we got 6 chapters, and I'll probably do 2 chapters, one half chapter each time we do this. So it says here that in verse 11, Paul is explaining to these Galatians. And by the way, if you look in chapter 3, verse 1, he really gets kind of rough with them. He says, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed among you as crucified?" That's what he's doing. You look at all the other letters that Paul wrote, the letter to the Romans, both letters to the Corinthians, to the Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, to the church at Thessalonica, and you'll see that he puts in words of praise for all of them, but not here. He's kind of angry, and he wants them to know he's serious about this. And so he goes on in verse 11 of the first chapter. He says, "But I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ." So Paul is saying to them, look, I didn't make this up. This is the truth, and I received it directly from Jesus Christ. Now, how did that happen? When did that happen? Well, we'll discuss that in just a minute, so hold on. We'll get to it. And so he's telling them that this message is from Jesus Christ. That should be something that every preacher needs to understand. I do hope that every time I get up here that I deliver the truth. And I work hard at doing that. I want to make sure, because I feel a tremendous responsibility that if I don't get it right, I'm liable to lead somebody astray. Now, that's not to say I haven't goofed up in the past. I have, I'm human too. But still in all, I work hard at getting this right, and every preacher should do that. And not just every preacher, but every single Christian needs to be familiar enough with the gospel message that they can converse intelligently with other people about what it takes to come to terms with their relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ. And so he goes on to talk about his past in verses 13 and 14. He says, "For I neither received it from man," or that's in verse 12, 13. He says, "For you have heard of my former conduct in Jerusalem, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. Paul, if you look at his explanation of himself, it's in the 22nd chapter of the book of Acts, I believe, after he had been saved by the Roman army who was based there near the temple area. Paul had been nearly beat to death by some of his own people, some of the Jews, and the Roman cohort that was there saved his life. But Paul wanted to explain to his fellow Jews exactly why he had done what he was doing, and he gives a little background about himself. He talks about how he was a Pharisee. Now, these Pharisees were the best men that Israel had to offer. They were the ones who followed zealously the law of Moses, along with all of the corollaries and commentaries that the scribes had made in regard to the law of Moses. Very difficult thing to do. He was born in Tarsus, which was in Cilicia, which again was in Asia Minor, not too far from Galatia, where he had planted these churches. And he was also had studied at the feet of the most renowned teacher of that day, a man by the name of Gamaliel. And Gamaliel shows up in the book of Acts. There was one time whenever the Sanhedrin was wanting to squash the Christian effort right there through Peter and John, and they were looking at things. What can we do to stop this? And Gamaliel comes up, and he's quoted in the book of Acts. He says, let's leave them alone. If this is from God, nobody's going to stop it. If this is from man, it'll fizzle out. He didn't say it in so many words, but that's about the effect of it. And so that's some very wise words. And of course, we know that despite all of the opposition that Christianity has had over the centuries, we're still here, and we will always be here. Chinese Premier Xi, he's tried to crush it. Stalin tried to crush it. Hitler tried to crush it. You can't stop it because it is of God, and it is going to continue. And so Paul says, I was one of those who opposed Christianity. I was a Pharisee. I caused a lot of woe to the people who were professing Jesus Christ. And so he goes on to say, then, he says, here we have Paul the preacher now, beginning there in verse 15. He says, but when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb, and called me through his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood. Let's stop at that comma right there. It says here, and this is remarkable. He said he was separated from his mother's womb before he was born. God had looked in him, in his soul, and he knew the mission that Paul would launch out on someday. Now, this sounds like justification for the doctrine of election. But let's look at it like this. In Romans chapter 8, verse 29, it says this, those whom he did foreknow, he also did predestine. What comes first? The foreknowledge of God. You see, God can know what our choices are going to be and yet not interfere with those choices. That confirms God's sovereignty, but it also opens up the fact that we are a free moral agent and not some pre-programmed robot that has to do what God has programmed us to do, because the doctrine of election, as it's seen today by some of the religions, indicates that what is happening is that God has created some people for the purpose of going to heaven. But if that's the case, what about those others who have not been elected? has he created them so that they can go to hell? Well, I'm sorry, but I cannot imagine a God of love such as our God is, actually creating a soul so that they can actually go to hell. No, the foreknowledge comes first. And then God, who knows our choices, is going to guide us, and his will is going to be done. So Paul had the free choice to do what he did, even though he was separated from his mother's womb. You know, there's some things that I don't know about this. Do you remember in the Gospels whenever Mary went to visit her relative Elizabeth? Elizabeth was 6 months pregnant with the baby that would be John the Baptist. And Mary, probably looking for somebody to commiserate with, somebody that would understand what was going on in her own body, it says that whenever she came into the house of Elizabeth, that the baby in Elizabeth's womb jumped with joy. Somebody explain that to me, okay? Because that goes beyond my pay grade. But I know one thing, we have a God who is in control. And God is going to see his purposes through. So here we see Paul, and God gave him the message, and he was chosen, regardless of what you say, he was chosen by the grace of God. It wasn't anything that he earned, something God appointed him to do, something that he was going to be able to accomplish in doing God's will. And what was the message anyway? Well, it says that he was to reveal his Son. You know, when you think about it, isn't that the purpose of all of us being here? I mean, isn't that the reason that we're using up resources, taking up space, breathing up oxygen and all that? It's not just so we can sit back and wait till the Lord comes back or till we go to him, whichever comes first. No, he's given us something to do as Christians, and that is to be a witness. To be a witness. And how do we be a witness? Some people say, I can't do that. I don't know enough about the Bible. Look, all you have to do is tell others what Jesus means to you and how he has changed your life. You don't have to be a biblical expert. Now, it helps if you are. But still in all, you don't have to be, because you can just tell other people sincerely what Jesus Christ has done in your life. And so Paul said that this was his purpose. He said it was to reveal his Son in me. In me. Whenever people looked at him, he wanted them to see Jesus. Every once in a while in a prayer, I'll hear somebody say, hide Brother Charles behind the cross. I love that, because that's what I want to be. I don't want people to see me. I want them to see Jesus. And he says that I might preach him among the Gentiles. There was the reason that God called Paul out, so that he could go to a specific group of people who had been ignored. You see, that's why God used the Jewish nation. Going back to Abraham, the very first Jew, he told him that your descendants are going to be as numerous as the sand of the sea, or the seacoast, and as numerous as the stars in the sky. And there's Abraham, 100 years old, and he hadn't had a child yet, but he believed God. And so when it comes right down to it, we're going to discover here in the book of Galatians that all of us who are Christians are also of the seed of Abraham through faith in Jesus Christ. You can look ahead at Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, and you can see that. But anyway, but here you see God had never intended for the Jewish nation to have exclusive ownership of God. God's love intended to reach out to everybody, And he was going to use Paul to do it. And so Paul's mission was to go to the Gentiles, and that's what started him off on this first missionary journey. Whenever he left Antioch along with Barnabas, they went over to Cyprus first, then they turned north and came in on the south side of Asia Minor, and then they went across the Galatian churches of Iconium and Derbe and Lystra, to name three. And so they did this, and he said, I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. In other words, anybody's permission to do this. God gave it to me. And then he says something that we haven't seen before. He says, but then I went to Arabia. Now, where is that in the Bible except for right here? Well, it's not anywhere. But we get hints of it in the 9th chapter of the book of Acts. Turn over there for just a minute. The 9th chapter of the book of Acts. In verse 23. Now this is happening right after Paul had been converted. He was found by this man Ananias, who prayed over him and restored his eyesight. He'd been blind for 3 days. And then he begins preaching there in Damascus, preaching the gospel to those who he had come to arrest. And it says there that after many days were passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, because he had now become one of them, and it was ruining their whole theological outlook on things. You see, it was more important to them to preserve a false teaching instead of accepting the truth that God was trying to get him. And so they plot to kill him, but their plot became known to Saul. That's who Paul was called at the time. And they watched the gates day and night to kill him. They're watching the gates in Damascus. If they see him going through, they're going to kill him right then. Then it says the disciples took him by night and let him down through the wall in a large basket. Well, where is he going? Where is he going? And when Saul had come to Jerusalem, but what about this trip to Arabia that we just read about in Galatians? I do believe, and I'm not the only one who believes this, most commentators believe this, that between verses 25 and 26, Paul went to Arabia. And there he spent 3 years, as it says here in Galatians. He spent 3 years there in Arabia, and what was he doing? He was getting his doctorate of theology in Jesus. Now, either through the Holy Spirit or, and I kind of believe this, through the personal attention of the resurrected Christ. Because, folks, our whole theology is based on the writings of Paul. You look here in the Bible, and everything, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and even those personal letters, the 2 to Timothy, and the 1 to Titus, and the 1 to Philemon. And I also believe, and this is my personal belief, I believe he wrote Hebrews too. You look at all of that, and there is the theology that you and I believe today. That is what is the foundation of what we believe. And where did he get it? He got it from Jesus. He got it from those 3 years that he spent there in Arabia. And you know, you look at your historical books and history books and start putting things together, and this was an opportune time for him, because by the time that he would have started off on this sojourn to Arabia, Tiberius Caesar would have died. And then the most evil Caesar who ever ruled Rome, Caligula, came on the throne. And he was only there 4 years. And he was killed by his own palace guard because they got enough of him. Caligula was only 28 when he when he was killed. And so it's during Caligula's reign that Paul was off there by himself. It would not have been good for him to be in Palestine with Caligula's reign of terror going on everywhere. And then succeeding Caligula was Claudius, and there was a little bit, the heat was taken off of them for a while. But here's Paul. He's out there in Arabia, and he's getting this information. He said that I spent this time, he said I went to Arabia, and then he had returned to Damascus after the 3 years were up. And then he says, after that, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter and remained with him 15 days. Why did he see Peter? You see, Peter had the prejudice kicked out of him too. Peter had been a zealous Jew. But we look in the 10th chapter of the book of Acts, and we see that Peter was staying in this place, and he had a dream. And the dream was God was giving him all kinds of things to eat, some of which were forbidden for a Jew to eat according to the Levitical law. And Peter wakes up in a cold sweat, and he says, I wouldn't touch any of that stuff. And he goes back to sleep, and the same dream comes. And he said, what's going on? I would never eat any of that. And then God impressed upon him, what God has made clean, you can eat. And about that time, there's a knock on the door of the house where he's staying, and it's some servants of a Roman centurion by the name of Cornelius. And God has been dealing with Cornelius, who is a Gentile. He's not a Jew. And so these servants come and say, our master Cornelius would like for you to come and explain things to him. And so Peter gets up, and here's a man who would never enter the house of a Gentile, but he goes into Cornelius' house, and he realizes that God also has feelings for these people too, for everybody. Peter would have been there whenever Jesus told the Pharisee Nicodemus that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, and whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. And there's Cornelius. And so Peter starts preaching. And before he can finish the sermon, must have been a long sermon, which reminds me, before he can finish the sermon, the Holy Spirit comes and fills everybody in that place. Peter doesn't even get to give an invitation. The Holy Spirit did. And so Peter recognizes, even though this is against the grain of everything that his contemporaries, his other apostles believe, he realizes that the message is for the Gentiles as well. And so who better for Paul to commiserate with that would understand this mission to the Gentiles than Peter? And so he goes to him, and for 15 days they talk about this. Love to know what exactly they talked about. But then he says, but I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. When did he become an apostle? You know, there's 3 men in the Bible named James. James, the brother of John, he was the first apostle to be martyred. He was beheaded in the 12th chapter of Acts by Herod Agrippa I. So where did his apostleship come? Did the Lord himself confer that upon him? I believe so, because one of the things that Jesus did, and we look in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we can see this. One of the things that Jesus did was, after his resurrection, he wanted to see some people. He said, I want to see Peter. I want to see this. I want to see James. Not James the apostle, James his brother, or half-brother. Now there was another James who was an apostle. His name is James the son of Alphaeus, James the Less, they sometimes call. Nothing that he ever said is recorded in the Bible, but he was one of the 12. So we're not talking about that one either. We're talking about James, the half-brother of the Lord. In other words, he was one of the natural children of Mary and Joseph, and he wanted his brother to know. There's another brother, Jude. He also wrote a little letter right before the book of Revelation. So at least a couple of his brothers became believers, very strong believers. And apparently, James, the half-brother of the Lord, was also known as an apostle, and we do know that he became the pastor of the church in Jerusalem. And then he goes on to say here, now concerning the things that with which I write to you, indeed before God I do not lie. Afterward I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia. Now Cilicia was where he was born and raised, there in Tarsus. That's where Cilicia was. And he said, I was unknown by face to the churches of Judea which were in Christ. So now his reputation, it's kind of cooled off now, and those people who were afraid of him before, they don't know him so well anymore, but they were hearing only this: he who formerly persecuted us now preaches the faith which he once tried to destroy. Like I say, folks, the Lord can turn anybody around. Nobody can be so far gone that they are beyond the reach of Jesus Christ. I've seen it happen so many times. It's amazing. Talk about miracles. That's a miracle. And so, because of the fact that he had been turned around, it opened the eyes of other people. And so this chapter closes by saying, and they glorified God in me. Because of what I did, it glorified God and caused these people to realize that there is a power at work that is here that is greater than anything that can be imagined. So we'll close right there, and next week we'll pick up on chapter 2. Before we have prayer, is there any questions or comments about anything so far? Everything's completely clear. Okay. Oh, yeah. He was a Pharisee. Paul was a Pharisee. He said that he was of that school. And he was on the upward, he was moving up the corporate ladder. He might even have been chief high priest one of these days, although a Pharisee never was one. It was always a Sadducee, because the Sadducees were willing to collaborate with the Roman government, and the Pharisees weren't. And the Roman government always had to approve who the chief priest was, so they always picked a Sadducee because they knew it was a political move. So, but anyway, he had a good reputation among even the Sadducees, because he got these letters from the Sadducee, who was the chief priest, to go to Damascus and get these people. So, all right, anything else? Talked to Ron Klein yesterday, and he said that Norma is 99.9% back to normal. So I heard her in the background say something, so I don't know if she was agreeing with him or not, but anyway, I think she's coming along well, so let's continue to pray for them. And Drew, good to see you back here too as well. Appreciate you being here. So all the folks who've had surgery here seem to be on the road to recovery, so we're grateful for that. You have anything else that you want to remember? Let's pray for our people coming back from Lake Murray tonight. So they're going to stay till dark and then get back here probably about 10:30 or so. Yes. Yeah, I saw that. Where are they staying? Yeah, where are they staying? Okay, all right. So they got out of there. Yes, I was watching that tonight on the news. It's such a pretty area. You hate to see it ruined like that. Anything else? let's have a word of prayer, and then we can be dismissed. Bobby, would you lead us in prayer?